How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to Set 6, and today we're going to be going over some beginner tips for Queen's Blood. Queen's Blood is the new, crazy, addictive card game that's in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and yeah, some people have been struggling with it a little bit, so today's video is just some beginner tips for Queen's Blood so that you can have the best experience and progress through the game. Don't forget, hit the like button, subscribe for future content, but we're not messing about, let's get into it. So Queen's Blood is played on a board that is made up of 3 rows and 5 columns. Your goal is to win as many rows as possible with as high a score as possible. At the end, you gain points for each row that you win, and the person with the highest score wins. Sounds pretty simple, right? And it kind of is, but it also isn't. So we're going to go over, like I say, 5 bits of beginner info that I feel that you'll need for Queen's Blood. And the first of these is to take a look at the cards and learn the cards. Now, Queen's Blood cards are made up of 3 main features. The first of these, the level, determines where on the board that you can place the card. In Queen's Blood, as you place a card, you'll open up new spaces, and these spaces will have a level indicated by a small pawn icon. In order to place a card on a space, the space must have at least the number of pawns that are shown on the card. So a card with 1 pawn in the top left hand corner can be played on any space that you've claimed, whereas a card with 2 pawns in the top left hand corner cannot be played on a space that only has 1 pawn. It can only go in spaces with 2 or 3. So you can go up and place cards on spaces that have got a higher level, but not a lower level. Now, the second thing on a card that you need to pay attention to is the power. This is the most simple thing. This is how many points you will gain on the row that you play this card. This number can be raised or lowered by cards with abilities, but we will come back to that. In general though, the score is how many points you will get. And then the final thing on the card is the grid. Now, this shows the impact the card will have when you place it on the board. The white space in the centre of the grid is you. So when you place a card down, that is you. And when you look at the grid, you will see that around the white square you will find yellow squares. And these yellow squares indicate a spot that will gain a level of your colour by placing this card. So for example, the security officer card will add 1 level to the squares above, right, left and below. This is how you claim squares on the board, and it's also how you raise the level of squares on the board. An unclaimed square will be claimed and made a level 1 square, a level 1 square will become a level 2 square, a level 2 square will become a level 3 square. The only other thing on cards to take note of are the abilities. Now, abilities tend to have an impact on spaces on the board, indicated on the card grid with a red outline on the square. Now, these abilities tend to boost or diminish the power of cards in the red spaces, but there are other abilities that can do other things. Titan has an ability where when you place it down, it doubles the level gain for the yellow squares around it. Things like that. But as long as you focus and understand on the first 3, the 4th will fall into place over time. Abilities can be a little bit tough, but as you use them more and become exposed to them more, you will pick them up. And we will dip into 1 or 2 ability cards that are going to be very useful for you early on in the game. But we're moving on to tip 2. And tip 2 is to plan a strategy. Now, this is figuring out a way that you want to play. And this will change over time, and it will vary depending on your opponent. But generally, a good early tactic is to push forwards as far as you can and then try and cut off your opponent by placing cards far forwards and then backfilling your side of the board from there. Now, it doesn't always work, but it's generally a good starting point for early Queen's Blood, and if you start with this tactic, you can adapt it as you're going through games and you'll find a way to play that works better for you. Another thing to watch out for is to make sure that you protect the squares that you've taken. So for example, when you take a square with 1 pawn, make sure that you have another space around it in order to protect that space should it get taken. I'll show an example up on the screen right now, but yeah, just make sure that you double cover in your spaces, and that way you shouldn't kind of get blocked off yourself. Because one thing that this can lead to is you ending up with not enough spaces and you end up losing. So just make sure that you protect your moves. Now, as you get further into the game, you will need slightly more tailored strategies, but we'll cover some of those in another video. This is purely the basics and some starting tips. And the most important starting tip at number 3 is to buy cards. Every time you get to a new town, every time you get to a new location, check the item shop, check the vending machine. Make sure that you buy any Queen's Blood cards that are available. Don't look at a card and think, no, I don't fancy that one. Buy it. Because you will then give yourself more options when it comes to the next tip. Make sure that you're buying all the cards. And that leads into the next tip, which is deck balance. Now, a Queen's Blood deck is made up of 15 cards. But as we went over earlier, not all cards are created equally. They have different powers, they have different levels, and they have different grid layouts, and some of them have different abilities. I found that there are two main ways to balance the deck at a basic level. The first of these is to make sure that you can play cards. If you fill your deck up with level 2 and 3 cards, you'll probably lose very quickly, because you won't be able to get cards down on the board. On the flip side of that, having a deck full of level 1 cards will probably also lose due to low scores, even if you win in rows. I found that having 8 level 1 cards, 5 or 6 level 2 cards, and then the rest at level 3, so 1 or 2 level 3 cards, is a good spot to be in generally. That tends to be a good setup. You'll always have lower level cards available to you to play, but then you'll also have some higher level cards for when you really want to crank up the score. Now the second part of balancing comes back to strategy, but generally you want to make sure that the cards that you place in add levels to a variety of squares around them. Having all cards that boost the same squares in the same directions is going to limit you, it's not going to give you the options that you need. Cards that move forwards as well as up and down are probably the most useful, so cards like the Security Officer, great for covering space quickly, but it's very weak, so you won't get many points, it won't help you score. You also, like I say, want to pay attention to some ability cards. One of the more useful ones that you get early on is the Crystalline Crab. Playing the crab in the first space of the middle row will push forwards like we want to, and you will still be able to place a Security Officer down in that second space in that middle row, but it will also boost the score by 2 of the space above the Crystalline Crab, meaning that when you do eventually place a card there, it will gain extra points. And this is a good way to stack your score, especially if you've got a level 2 card or a level 3 card that's high scoring. You can slap it in there and hopefully secure a victory on that row. Now just briefly touching on abilities, some abilities play into each other. For example, there are cards that gain power when any card is destroyed, and that can be paired with a card that creates a -1 power spot. All you have to do then is feed cards with 1 power to that -1 power spot, and they will be played, instantly destroyed, and will boost the power of the card that we played initially. This can take a little bit of setup, but if you can make it happen, it's a very good strategy, and it just means you can sit there farming points on a card until you just win. As a final point, if you are struggling, maybe set up a few different decks that work towards different goals. You do have the ability to set up multiple decks, although early on there shouldn't be a huge amount of diversity in strategy. There will be some. Later on, however, you definitely want to be looking at using additional decks. And then the final tip that I've got for you is to keep trying. And this may sound like, oh god, that's a rubbish tip, but genuinely, the game can be punishing, but I highly recommend you to keep going and you will get there with it. Sometimes you can lose purely because your opponent got a perfect starting hand and just blew you away. Sometimes it can be that you got an exceptionally bad starting hand. Although if this happens, you probably need to rebalance your deck. That's something to be looking at. If you're constantly getting hands that are bad at the start of a game, redo your deck. If you keep losing a game, try and look at where you're losing the game. Are they pushing forwards faster than you can handle? Try and cut them off. Try and stop the route that they're trying to expand on. Rather than filling spaces in yourself, focus on stopping them. Are they maybe using an ability that's destroying you, like the one that we mentioned earlier? Learn what the ability does, and then see if you've got any abilities in your deck to counteract it. Are you moving too fast maybe and leaving yourself exposed at the back? Slow it down, stack on power on squares a little bit rather than claiming more land. Like I say, the land grab technique works a lot, but it doesn't always work, and sometimes a slower and steadier approach can be helpful. And then the last thing to check is, have you updated your deck recently? Sometimes you might have forgotten to add a card that you've won or bought, and just adding that card to your deck will counteract what's going on in the game that you're losing, giving you the win. There are so many different things to check. If you go through that checklist, if you're losing a game constantly, go through that checklist and just think, are all of these things right? Change things up a little bit, see how it goes. But either way, Queen's Blood is an insanely fun game. With what seems to be a pretty extreme depth of options, Hopefully, these beginner tips are going to help you get to grips with it at a basic level, and then you can grow from there and develop your own strategies. Although, like I say, in the future, I will drop another video with more specific strategies and builds that you can go with. For now, though, I'm going back into my cave to play Rebirth because I've spent far too long working on this video. So, yeah, thanks very much for watching. Have a great day. Leave some comments below if you're struggling with more specific things in Queen's Blood. Don't leave any Rebirth spoilers in the comments because you'll get banned. But more importantly than anything, have a great day.